Welcome back to this series on gear, which I'll be filming in my music studio. This is where I create all the music for my channel. I recently had a few requests to review the gear that I use, and I do love gear, so I figured I'd put together this series. I have always used YouTube to research gear before I actually bought it, so I figured I'd give back by talking about the gear that I use and try to help others decide whether it's the right gear for them. I'm starting this series with knives. As a young child growing up in the Pennsylvania mountains, I have always had a knife on me as a tool. Also growing up in the 80s with every epic adventure movie out there, starting with Rambo Part 1, which kicked off the entire survival knife craze at that time.
Why would you be carrying a knife like this?
Hunting.
On to Predator, Commando, and up to MacGyver and his Swiss Army knife. Knives have always played a critical role in every epic adventure. Over the years, I have amassed a large collection of knives, which I didn't even know that I had this many until I put this series together. But looking at each individual knife here, it takes me back to the actual adventure or situation that I actually had that knife on me for. Some knives excelled for their purpose and some didn't. And it took some refining to actually narrow it down to the ones that I actually still carry today. I'm going to start this off with the oldest knife chronologically as far as when it was released and designed would be the Balasong or butterfly knife. This thing has origins back to 800 AD in the Philippines. There's some argument over whether this was influenced by a French measurement tool at that time, which does look very similar to this, but most of the records and the name itself, Balasong, comes from the Philippines. And there's a lot of different tricks you can do with it. It's deployed by spinning and flicking it open. These knives are actually illegal in 23 different countries, including Washington State, but it is definitely an effective tool. It's been around for a while. I got this one back during my my 1980s martial arts ninja phase.
I've been expecting you.
A ninja does not betray his destiny.
The next knife would be the Swiss Army knife or the officer's knife. This thing was developed in 1891 for the Swiss Army. In 1893, Wenger shared part of that contract, and they both began designing knives. The way you distinguish between the Victorinox and the Wenger is the actual coat of arms on the knife, where Victorinox actually has a shield around the cross, and Wenger has more of a squared off design around that cross. But Victorinox actually purchased Wenger just actually recently, and now all blades, all Swiss Army knives are made by Victorinox. On to the epic KABAR, Marine Corps fighting knife. This knife was adopted by the Marine Corps in 1942. The name KABAR comes from the manufacturer of this knife was Union Cutlery, and in 1923 a trapper wrote a letter to the company saying that he used one of their KABARs to kill a bear that attacked him after his rifle fired while hunting. And the letter was difficult to actually read, and they figured out that the KABAR in the letter was killed a bear. And these things were called KABARs from that point on. In 1952, Union Cutlery actually changed their name to KABAR. But this is one of the most solid knives out there. This is one of the newer ones with the polymer handle versus the older leather washer grip. But the design remains the same. It's still a very solid knife, 1095 steel. These things have been used for every possible use you could think of, as a tool, as a digging tool, as a hammer, as a striking weapon. This is just a very solid and effective blade. Next is the Air Force Survival Knife, or ASEC as it's known by the military, which was Air Crew Survival Egress Knife. This thing was designed in 1953 by Marble Arms. They went up for contract to the government with Camillus in Ontario. Camillus won the contract in 1959 and manufactured these things up to 2006 for the military. These things were very popular in backpacks of outdoorsmen and backpackers back in the 70s and early 80s. This knife is still in stock with the military, and so it has the leather washer handle design. This butt end can be used as a hammer. The saw blade up there, a lot of people thought this was to cut wood, but it's actually used to cut through the fuselage of the aluminum aircraft of that time. But definitely a very strong and solid knife. This knife is actually constructed of the same 1095 steel as the KABAR. But as aircraft material design changed, the military went back to Gerber in the early 2000s and requested them to actually create something that could cut through and stand up to the modern aircraft. Gerber released the LMF-2 infantry. And this thing was designed to be able to cut through modern helicopter fuselage and their windshields. So this is a glass breaker at the end, serrated blade with holes on it to lash into a spear. Very strong knife. And this thing has an epic history. The pommel is actually isolated from the rest of the body through some composite materials in here so that you cannot get shocked if you're cutting through electrical wires, which is by design, which was the issue with this thing here. If they were cutting through an aircraft, they could get shocked with this end here if they hit a wire while they're cutting through the wall of the aircraft. This thing here is completely isolated from the rest of the blade at the end here. There's actually stories out there, there's a knife posted online you can find where a US soldier used this to cut through a 220 generator line after our Iraqi army lit up their position with the lights from the generator. So that soldier cut that line, shut it off, and they can continue with their operation. Navy SEALs have also commented about using this thing. One SEAL commented to use this thing to dig through a brick wall so he could use it as a firing position. And he said it was just simply a matter of putting it back into the sharpener, built into the sheath to get it back up and running. The only thing I don't like about this thing is it does not hold an edge very well. It gets dull very quickly, but I mean, this thing can chop down some stuff. You can use this to build a shelter. I've used it to chop down trees, branches, and make a nice little lean-to shelter. Very strong knife, very solid. There's actually videos online of a guy cutting through car doors with this bad boy. So he cut right through it, didn't damage a thing. I mean, he put it through a definite torture test and it survived. So I want to go back to 1989, where SEAL Team 6 was carrying a custom-made fixed blade knife. They wanted some type of tactical folder. So they came to Emerson and asked them to make them a tactical folder, which he did. He called it the CQC-6, and he would custom make this for SEAL Team 6. It stood for Close Quarters Combat. The 6 was for SEAL Team 6 with Special Operations Units, Special Forces, SEALs, and they were all custom ordering these things from Emerson. And it was actually featured in a couple of Richard Marcinko books talking about it. But yeah, it's a famous knife. The problem is it costs $700 if you can actually get on the lottery to buy the knife. And secondhand units online have sold for anywhere between $3,000 and $6,000. So back in 2014, Kershaw came to Emerson and asked him to build an affordable version of his CQC-6. And that is what this is. This is the CQC-8. Very similar design elements of the original CQC-6. It's obviously a cheaper metal, cheaper blade, and it's made in China, unfortunately. But it retains most of the design as far as the single-edged blade, which makes it easier to sharpen and retain its edge longer. Tanto blade with no serration. And then finally, the classic wave feature that Emerson developed and patented for his knife. So what this does is allows you to draw this from your pocket, and as this catches the pocket, it opens the blade up as you draw it. But definitely a very solid knife, one of my favorites to carry. It's a little heavy, but as far as a tactical combat knife, you cannot go wrong with this thing. But as for the one knife that I carry on a daily basis, it comes down to the Fox Knives Karambit. This thing is it's based off an old Indonesian design that started as a farm tool and evolved into a defensive knife. But it has a ring that basically makes this thing an extension of your hand. But this thing has multiple functions. I carry this thing on my weak side, and it actually uses the same Emerson wave opening mechanism. It's the same patented Emerson wave mechanism on this blade. So you pull it out, as you pull it out of your pocket, it's ready to roll. But this thing has multiple purposes. It has the ring, which can be used as a pain compliance tool or defensive ring. It has a glass breaker on the bottom, so there's definitely less lethal options on this blade. Once it's open, it actually does have a dual locking mechanism. So you lock this thing out and the liner is not going to shut this thing. and it turns it almost into a fixed blade knife. It's a smaller blade, but no serrations, so it's all just cutting surface here. Very sharp steel. This is the N690 steel, and it's one of the better steels out there. It's probably the best steel that I have in any of my knives here. I think it's comparable to the V10 steel, but definitely one of my favorite knives, and it's the one that I carry on a daily basis for work. So going back to Gerber knives, the classic Applegate Fairbairn knife. So this was a classic combat knife that was very similar to this stiletto dagger knife used by combat troops throughout the ages. So Applegate, Colonel Rex Applegate actually collaborated with Gerber to create a foldable version of this knife, and this is what they came up with. Great knife, very solid, very hard to get right now. There's an auto version of this knife also for sale, but this is just a great combat folding knife. Spring assist, action, partial serration. This is not a multi-purpose knife. But shortly after that came out, Gerber came up with another military favorite, which was the Fast 06. Also has an automatic version, but this is a spring assist version. Great knife. I really like the feel of this thing. Very solid. No blade movement at all. Tanto blade with a partial serration. And very fast and smooth to open. It just feels good to open up. I carried this for a long time, but it is a large knife, and once again, it's not a multi-purpose tool. There's stories about the point actually breaking off pretty easily, but this is a defensive knife more than anything else. But a great knife with a glass breaker on the back end of it. Now, getting into some of my favorite for personal carry, it depends on what I'm doing. So if I'm camping or hiking, I always take this CRKT with me. One of my favorites. I really like the CRKT knives. This one's different than the rest of them because it actually has the AUS 8 blade material on it. But once again, a tanto, but it has minimal serrations and a huge amount of cutting area up here. But the really nice thing about this thing is it's a dual locking system. So it has a lock on the back and the liner lock. You have to press both to get this thing to lock or to close on you. The nice thing about it is once it's open, it basically turns into a fixed blade knife with this hilt. I mean, it's very similar to a fixed blade knife in a folder package. The other thing is it has their own wave type opening system. This thing here hooks onto the pant pocket as you're pulling it out, and it deploys. Very fast, very effective, really strong knife. Now I have the black version of this, which is a different blade type or different steel. It's a 1.411, very similar in their specifications. I think the AUS is the AUS 8 is a slightly better blade material. The thing I like about the black version is it has these VEF serrations. I prefer these over the smaller pointed serrations. Easier to sharpen too. But the same dual lock design, wave opening feature. Now, if I'm going into an area that has restrictions, a state that has restrictions on blade length or blade size, I go with the mini version of this thing. It's exact identical of this guy here, but it's a smaller one. Same functions, dual lock, VEF serrations on it. It's just a smaller blade. I usually take this one running. If I'm out running, this one's usually in my pocket. A couple of my other favorites are the Bokers. So these Bokers, once again, it's the AUS 8 blade material, same as this one here. And the AUS 8 is typically used in lower to mid-level, mid-range knives. I got this down in the Smoky Mountains years ago. So we used to trade the Smoky Mountains Knife Works catalog around as kids. It was like heaven going in that store, but I ended up buying 2 Bokers down there. So the black one, it's a tanto blade versus the drop point. Both have serrations. These are really just showpieces I keep in my collection. Now, if I want minimal, where I don't even know I have the knife on me, I turn to my SHRADE, my ceramic blade SHRADE. This thing is great. There's nothing fancy as far as the opener. but it opens nice and smooth, super sharp with the ceramic blade. But a great, very lightweight blade. You don't even know you have it on it when you're carrying it. So if I'm just wearing shorts or something like that. And so another one of my favorites has been with me for many years. My mother bought this for me when I turned 30. And it's a spring-assisted Kershaw that has lasted many, many years for me. Sharpens every time. This used to be my main camping and everyday carry knife. But yeah, it's just a great knife. It's more sentimental to me right now than anything. But I just quickly want to get in a couple of knives that I consider just tools. I don't care if they break or I lose them. It's no issue because they're inexpensive, but they're still strong and effective. So this one here's a great utility knife. It has a glass breaker on the back, great duty carry, belt cutter. It's called the Smith & Wesson Spec Ops, but it keeps a great blade, a great sharp blade, and strong, no wiggle, serrations on it. I have another one over here like that. This little Gerber has a flicker opening design. Once again, Tanto blade, serrations, lightweight, small, very strong. No movement there at all. But if I'm opening boxes or like Christmas Day, this is the knife that I turn to. But if you go back to one of the classics, the Buck 119, great classic knife. You know, most of these blade designs, including the KABAR, very similar, came from the old Bowie knife. And a lot of those designs carried over into these newer hunting and combat knives. But finally, I want to talk about survival knives. So, you know, starting back in the early Vietnam era, you started seeing knives pop up like the Randall Attack 9, I think it is, that actually had a hollowed out handle and you could stick survival items in there, or another smaller blade was carried in them. The earlier models had a cane cover tip that went over the handle, and eventually he released a screw-on back. Now that Randall significantly influenced the design of Jimmy Lyle's Rambo knife for First Blood Part 1, so it's not that far-fetched that a Vietnam era veteran would have had a knife like the one in Part 1. The blade definitely got bigger in Part 2 and then turned into a machete eventually, but ever since Rambo 1 came out, the survival knife industry just exploded. I can't tell you how many of those black ones with the big old compass on the outside top of the handle that would break as soon as you went to cut something. But I had so many of those knives that would break on me. One, my dad actually, somehow he cemented the inside so it wouldn't separate from the handle, and then the blade ended up breaking. But eventually, I saved up my money and I purchased, for me, the ultimate survival knife, and it was this bad boy. This thing, so it has everything. I mean, it's very similar to the one that Rambo carried in the movie. You know, it has the holes for lashing into a spear. It has the back that opens up. There was a compass in it. It's not there anymore. You can keep the survival items down inside the handle. But this thing has been on so many epic adventures with me since I was a little kid. I still remember running away for 2 days for, I don't remember what it was, something stupid. I probably just wanted to get out there with my knife and mess around, but I remember running away from home into the mountains, taking this with me. I planned on surviving the rest of my life with nothing but this knife.
They drew first blood, not me.
But yeah, it only made it 2 days. I think I got cold or something. I ended up back at the house. But this thing's been through so much with me. 440 stainless steel from the 80s, so it's not a very good steel. The old 440 was not that good. It was on all their cheap knives. But this is a Valor knife, Valor brand from Miami, Florida. But just a very cool knife. One actually comes with a really nice sheath. Like I said, it was very similar to Rambo's knife in Part 1. But I ended up trading this to a good friend for my first pistol. It was a 22 pistol. And, you know, back then we didn't have any money, so we had to trade for everything we wanted. So this ended up in my brother's hands at one point, and then, you know, it ended up back to me and then to my friend who traded it for the 22 pistol. Now after like 20, it might have been longer than that, 30 years, this thing's been with, yeah, 30 years this thing's been with that friend, and my brother recently managed to get it back off of him again. So it's once again in our family, which is great. So my brother actually created a stand to put this thing up on. There's a light shining down on it on top of his gun safe. But yeah, he gave it the perfect home for the epic knife that this thing is.